Picture this, you are a Hollywood starlet in the early 90s. You're not very educated, but you're very famous and very rich to boot. And you find yourself sitting in the lounge room of one of the most wildly famous late night television show hosts of all time, Johnny Carson. You're also sitting shoulder to shoulder with some absolute titans of the industry. And the man that you're there to see is the inventor of one of the biggest life-saving maneuvers of all time. And he is presenting to you how he himself has the ability to cure one of the most deadly diseases in the world at the moment. He's using lots of big words that you don't understand. He has pre-existing relationships with a lot of people in the room, and the people that are there that haven't met him before are handing over their money willingly because he's, quote unquote, saved lives in the past. Then he asks you for money. And what do? Well, like the famous people in this story that I will mention later, you probably would have given into the scientific wiles of this very charismatic man. Unfortunately, and potentially unbeknownst to you, you have just funded malariotherapy. This is the story of a man whose quest for fame saw his pseudoscience lead to deadly consequences. This is Dr. Henry Heimlich's malaria hysteria. If in the event you are having a meal with your family and someone begins to choke, your initial instinct, unless you had proper first aid training, would be to grab someone around the waist and make wild thrusts in order for you to get the food out of their airways. In the zeitgeist of history, this is obviously known as the Heimlich maneuver. The maneuver, discovered by Henry Heimlich in 1972 while inserting tubes into the throats of beagles and compressing their chests until they expelled the blockage, I wish I was kidding, and obviously relieve them of their choking. When he presented his findings, he was immediately met by a very skeptical Red Cross who maintained that back blows between the shoulder blades was the best way to clear anything out of the airways. The reason why they had this rebuttal is because there is no guarantee that people will still have air in their respiratory system for you to squeeze the blockage out of. It was a hotly debated topic at the time, but while all of the eggheads were arguing about which maneuver was the best maneuver, Henry Heimlich decided to bypass all that and go straight to Hollywood. He credits his famous relative and first cousin, you may or may not know, Anson Williams, who played Potsy in Happy Days. It was on Prime when I was a kid. I did like Happy Days. For bringing his maneuver to the mainstream. In the late 1970s, Potsy was invited to be on the Merv Griffin Show, another late night show from back in the day. And he mentioned that his first cousin that he called Uncle Hank, I don't know man, Americans are weird. He mentioned his Uncle Hank was in the crowd and had invented the Heimlich maneuver, and he was promptly invited up on stage to demonstrate how that would go. Because of the ratings of that show, the maneuver caught absolute fire, and he was immediately invited onto the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where he actually demonstrated his maneuver on Johnny Carson. The two became very good friends shortly after. This one moment seemingly forever lodged the Heimlich maneuver into America's lexicon, and because America's very loud, the world's lexicon as well. Lexicon. In 1985, the US Surgeon General himself even said that this was the only method for dealing with choking, and the Red Cross, who had been the authority on it for a number of years, quietly conceded and also made it their quote-unquote primary anti-choking method. Heimlich doubled down on this and even went as far as to create a smear campaign where he went around saying that the Red Cross's back blows would have lodged the blockage further, thus making it the inferior method. I'm using air quotes a lot because he talks a lot of... Thankfully, in recent years, the Red Cross has rescinded this and changed their primary method back to back blows. I learned this in first aid, so if any of you subscribers out there are ever choking, I don't know how I'm going to help, but know that I would have saved you if I was there. But we are not here to talk about the Heimlich maneuver. No sir. We are here to talk about crazy doctors injecting patients with malaria and other fun stuff like that. In order to understand why Henry Heimlich thought this was a good idea, we have to go all the way back to 1917. This is when Viennese psychiatrist, psychiatrist, not a medical doctor, by the name of Julius Wagner Jahregg, who, to his credit, had already dabbled with the idea of killing neurosyphilis with an incredibly high fever, had a soldier mistakenly assigned to his clinic. The soldier was suffering from malaria. He then apparently seized this opportunity to harvest this man's blood like goddamn Nosferatu. His reasoning was at the time there was no cure for neurosyphilis, but at the time there was a cure for malaria, which was a chemical known as quinine that came from tree bark. He would take the blood from the malaria-infected patient and inject it into the neurosyphilitic patient, often non-consensually. He would then raise their fever to an unsustainable height and treat it with pain relief and tree bark juice until they stabilized. This was to literally burn the spiral bacteria right out of your brain, and weirdly, it kind of worked. 6 out of 9 patients saw a vast improvement of their brain STD. Once people learned they could at least partially be cured by injecting someone else's mosquito bite infected blood into themselves, a lot of people around the world jumped at the chance, and this became a process known as pyrotherapy. In the long term, pyrotherapy cured about 50% of its patients, 35% saw no improvement whatsoever, and 15% carked it. Broski even earned himself a Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927, despite the fact that most of his patients were injected completely non-consensually, and this was all very, very experimental. Anyway, antibiotics gets discovered, and then World War II rolls around, and the need for antibiotics absolutely skyrockets. This leads to the discovery and the subsequent widespread distribution of synthetic penicillin. Pyrotherapy quickly fell out of use for obvious reasons. Also during World War II, the psychiatrist we were just talking about, Dr. Julian Wahrig, decides he's going to apply to link up with the Nazis. Apparently he was also a known eugenicist and an advocate for racial purity. He was that much of a scumbag that even the Nazis didn't want him. But that failed Nazi scumbag was a hero of the one and only Dr. Henry Heimlich. Using this exact, discredited, and incredibly dangerous methodology, Heimlich decided this might work on the newest pandemic that was sweeping the globe. Magic Johnson almost got it, Matthew McConaughey pretended to have it in a movie, and Freddie Mercury actually did die of it. It's AIDS. He tried to cure AIDS with malaria. And look, if we're being completely real here, Henry Heimlich wasn't actually interested in discovering a cure-all for AIDS. That wasn't his primary objective. According to his estranged eldest son, all he wanted was to be famous. He wanted to be widely respected in Hollywood and continue to rub shoulders with some of the most famous people on the planet, like he had done in the 70s when he invented the Heimlich maneuver. I've got to stop using air quotes. In 1993, his 1970s "people don't die from choking anymore because I humped Johnny Carson on TV" fame had unfortunately run its course. He was ready to burst onto the scene again, and he was willing to use AIDS to make that happen. He enlisted the help of Johnny Carson's wife Joanne, and together they started recruiting some of Hollywood's biggest names to try and bring a bunch of money together in order for him to start his trials. People in attendance who gave him money that night, and I wish I was kidding with this list: Jon Voight, Jack Nicholson, Bob Hope, Ron Howard, Angelica Houston, Dustin Hoffman, Jane Mansfield, and Ed Asner, just to name a few. And somehow, using technical jargon and medical mumbo-jumbo, this man managed to fleece some of Hollywood's biggest stars for $600,000 US. In today's inflated landscape, in 2024 dollars, that is 1.3 million US simoleons going towards malariotherapy. Some people in the audience that night, however, were not so convinced. One of them was Dr. Paul Bronston. He was an ER doctor and the head of the Medical Ethics Board, who had come as a guest of Oscar nominee Bruce Davison, who had just appeared in the AIDS-themed movie The Longtime Companion. Bronston has since said that he was going along because he wanted to meet the man behind the famous Heimlich maneuver. He knew it loosely had something to do with AIDS, but after sitting and listening, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Bronston told Inside the Hollywood Reporter, "I just fucking hit the ceiling. I went fucking crazy. It was dangerous. It was total bullshit. His proposal was giving malaria-infected blood to people who had AIDS. It doesn't take a genius to know that you don't give an infectious disease to someone who has a suppressed immune system." Over the course of the night, Bronston kept throwing very difficult questions at Henry Heimlich, and he tried to mitigate this by handing him personally a copy of his proposal. He even tried to buddy up to him by inviting him to appear in a documentary that Heimlich had commissioned about himself. Dr. Bronston obviously declined because no one wants to be a part of that shit. So Bronston's our guy at this point, okay? He's trying his absolute best to make sure that this thing doesn't leave the ground. He's pulling out all the stops. He's contacting the medical boards, the FBI, the CDC, the New England Journal of Medicine, and anyone who was connected to this proposal whatsoever. He contacted them directly, and most of them removed their names from this proposal as soon as they possibly could. This clearly wasn't enough to shake old mate Jaime though. He did, however, move his experiments from Mexico to China after the Mexican Board of Health came knocking, asking questions about the efficacy of what was going on. In a letter to a journalist in 1993, after reading the immunomalariotherapy proposal put forth by Dr. Henry Heimlich, Dr. Carlos Del Rio, who is apparently Mexico's AIDS Dr. Big Dog, said, "I can say that I was outraged by its lack of scientific basis as well as poor ethics. I have no idea why Heimlich has moved to China, but we are delighted by the move." At exactly the same time, the Department of Health and Human Services had come after the Heimster, trying to tell him, basically, you just better not. Also, his fundraising efforts were investigated by the major fraud department of the Department of Justice, but no charges at all were laid against the Heiminator, and he was safely on his way to China scot-free. With his bank account filled to the brim, Heimlich gave the go-ahead for human trials to kick off in a hospital in Guangzhou. Dr. Chen Xiaoping, who was Heimlich's man on the scene in the Far East, put in a request for $10,000 to cover hospital fees, blood tests, and even a little bit of a bonus for some of the medical staff who were dealing directly with HIV patients. Patients were handed consent forms which outlined some of the things that may or may not happen if you receive this treatment. There was a laundry list of side effects. It could be anything from chills to muscle weakness to an unexpected dance with the Grim Reaper. Fast forward to July of 1993, and only 2 HIV-positive patients had agreed to jump on board, which left the American financial backers aggressively and impatiently tapping their feet. Heimlich was feeling the heat, obviously, and pushed Dr. Chen to find some new recruits. Finally, in July of 1994, Dr. Chen had managed to rustle up 7 HIV-positive, drug-addicted souls from the Yunnan province and ship them off to Guangzhou, not for a holiday, but for some lovely malaria jabs. Cut to Dr. Chen's next update in August of 1994, where he sent a letter to Henry Heimlich saying, "Please come sooner rather than later." The situation had gone haywire. The HIV-positive drug addicts that Dr. Chen had brought into the hospital were stealing from other patients, causing full-on brawls, escaping from the hospital and trying to get a fix. Security guards were hired to try and keep this whole thing in line, but they couldn't really do much, and Heimlich's response to his letter was basically just keep the waivers signed and all will be well. It wasn't well. My God. In his first report back to the American donors, a full 36 months after these trials had began, apparently there was 2 scraps of paper where he had written down very vague notes about screening donors for malaria parasites and an incredibly lackadaisical conclusion about how it's not very effective at this point. Needless to say, a lot of people who had given a lot of money to a man who hadn't produced any results in 3 years were a little bit pissed off. This was then followed up in October of 1996 when Dr. Chen himself sent a report back saying that case number 6 had unfortunately passed away. Cause of death? Mysterious circumstances. Case number 6 was one of the HIV positive and drug addicted patients, so his cause of death could have been anything from AIDS to malaria to drugs. After his escapades in China, for whatever reason, this dude went to East Africa and took his malariotherapy show on the road. Legend has it he played personal doctor to 13 HIV positive patients where he injected them with doses of P-Vivax. P-Vivax is another term for the malaria parasite. I should have mentioned that earlier. I'm not very good at writing scripts. There were no reports of deaths around this time, but then again, there were no reports at all. In 1996, he even tried to flaunt his exploits at the International AIDS Convention in Vancouver, Canada. In his memoir, he made it sound like he was talking to thousands of people about how well malaria therapy was going, but that's not the case at all. Apparently, all it was an A3 poster that he had printed off himself and stuck up in one of the hallways. He stood beside it for a couple of hours, and people could stop and talk to him about his findings, between going and seeing actual doctors who were actually trying to cure AIDS. Despite the lukewarm reception from his peers and the sad nods he was getting from people in positions of power, the CDC and the NIH just looked down their noses at him because this dude was a quack. Somehow dude remained completely unscathed. No one said anything to him and there were no charges brought against him whatsoever. No slap on the wrist, not even a finger wag. Dr. Henry Heimlich, a mad hatter of a doctor, had managed to somehow get away with this almost completely scot-free. In his tell-all memoirs, Heimlich spills the beans about his malariotherapy, even dedicating 3 pages to singing its praises. He even throws in a disclaimer about the Heimlich maneuver being dog-tested and doctor-approved. But he himself clarifies that if he were to play mad scientist today, that fluffy animals would be off the hook. Apparently he's all about that animal welfare vibe now. He's finished torturing beagles for profit. My question is, why then would you have a change of heart when it comes to humans? This is also $1 million question that was thrown around by the World Health Organization back in 2002. They threw shade for Heimlich and his crew because of the clearly shady things he was doing that no one talked about for over a decade. Team Heimlich, on the other hand, apparently came back and said it's all about saving lives, darn it. And they decided that if they were going to pursue this form of science, that sometimes ethics needs to take a back seat. There is a major difference between ethics taking a back seat, torturing animals, and infecting people with malaria. Just that is the personal opinion coming through from this video. But what does the man himself have to say? Well, according to Dr. Henry Heimlich, it was a gamble worth taking. Henry Heimlich was a man who got so used to rubbing shoulders with some of Hollywood's elites that after his first wave of fame died off, he was doing anything to get back into that public sphere, just like the junkies who needed a fix that he was trying to treat in China. Don't get me wrong, this video was not about discrediting Henry Heimlich entirely. His maneuver, although second rate, has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. My own mother's life included. This video, more than anything else, was to highlight how far people would go once they've felt that warm touch of the spotlight, even just for a fleeting second. Dr. Henry Heimlich died at age 96 on a cold October day in Cincinnati, Ohio. Although his practices were extremely shady, he will always be remembered, which, unfortunately, is exactly what he wanted. Bit of a somber end to this video, I'm not gonna lie. I wrote this script like 2 months ago and I've been wrestling with the idea of whether I even do it because I had other scripts that were a little bit more fun. I just love the idea of this concept. I don't even know if what I've said in the script is gonna make any sense, but I'm gonna make the video anyway because I enjoy the process of editing. Make sure you go check out TikTok and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all that crap too. Peace and have a good day.